What do you think about when you think about museums? Do you think about beautiful objects isolated in glass cases? Do you think about school children cramming into busy galleries? You might even think about the expert knowledge held by curatorial staff. But would you think about well-being, mental health care, or support for people experiencing social isolation? Maybe not. My name's Judy Willcocks, and in this short presentation, I'm going to be talking about how we can mobilise museum collections in support of well-being. I've been head of the Museum and Study collection at Central St Martin's since 2008. Central St Martin's is now one of the largest and most comprehensive art schools in the UK, and it sits within University of the Arts London. We teach everything from art and architecture through fashion and performance to business administration and curation. We've got about 4,500 students. The teaching collection at Central St Martin's grew out of something that was put together in the late 1800s by the college's first principal. Back then they were collecting objects for what they thought those objects could tell students, either about materials or making processes. And that collection is rich in things like Japanese wood engravings, early prints, rare books, textiles and embroideries. Since then, the collection has continued to grow, most often through the donation of material that's been made by staff, students or alumni. And since the late 1980s, we've been collecting from student degree shows every year. And the resulting collection is a crazy mix of 3D printed jewellery, textiles made from woven fish skin or diluted by air pollution, even a virtual reality artwork. Using those collections to support teaching and learning has always been core to what I want the museum to be. And in the last few years, I've been developing a portfolio of pedagogic methodologies under the banner of object-based learning. I'm not going to talk about that at length here, not least because I've already made a short presentation about that work that can be accessed on the museum website. What I will say in brief is that since starting to think about my practice in terms of object-based learning, I've moved away from a more traditional curatorial practice of being the expert in the room and sharing that expert knowledge with museum visitors. Rather, I've reconceptualised objects as being a means for getting a conversation going, a focal point for meaning making. For me, as for Scott G. Paris, who came up with the term object-based learning or object-centred learning, something magic happens, a transaction between the object and the viewer where individual meaning is made. So for me, that's the really interesting thing that's worth thinking about and unpicking. It's all about individual experience. My earlier research around object-based learning was based on the acquisition of data from nearly 1,000 students. And what I discovered was the embodied, the multisensory or interactive aspects of object-based learning were considered to lead to deeper and richer learning experiences. I also discovered, not surprisingly, that for art and design students, something about the haptic properties of object-based learning, an opportunity to actually handle things, was seen as a key part of the learning experience. In short, what I discovered was the power of objects to initiate really deep and emotional learning experiences. This has important implications for the wellbeing agenda, as well as for teaching and learning. Now, for some of you, it may feel like a significant leap to go from thinking about objects in a learning and teaching setting to objects in a therapeutic setting. But for me, it's actually been a very natural evolution of ideas. That was driven in part by my personal interests. I've always been really interested in the history of medicine and the way that medicine is represented in museum collections. And in 2004, I actually published a children's book about this for British Museum Press. It was also very much driven by my personal, social and political beliefs. So I'm a firm believer that where we have cultural capital, whether that's materials or intelligence, skills or resources, that we should be sharing that for the public good. Now that really chimes with a lot of museum practice in the UK today, where we're seeing lots of museum institutions seeking to engage with their publics in a more socially engaged manner. Following a move to a new campus in King's Cross in 2011, I'd been thinking how we could mobilise the museum collections to better represent and work with our communities. And then the perfect opportunity arose when we were later invited to be part of the Museums on Prescription programme. Museums on Prescription was a 3-year research programme led by Canterbury Christchurch University and UCL, which wanted to explore the role of museums in social prescribing, particularly looking at adults who were experiencing social isolation. Now, social prescribing can be hard to pin down, but it's based on the premise that prevention is better and often cheaper than cure. Social prescribing might best be described as a way of linking patients with community-based interventions which have a positive health-related outcome, although they might not be medical in themselves. Evaluation of social prescribing schemes in the UK has shown that participants have seen increased psychological well-being, better sociability, and an improved sense of self-esteem. And all of those things can actually lead to a reduction in GP appointments and healthcare referrals. The Museums on Prescription programme gathered together 12 museums, each of whom was to deliver a 10-week course of activity for participants who were recruited via a link worker. We delivered that series of events to 11 participants in the early part of 2016, and it was clear to us as that course progressed that our participants were making new social connections and becoming calmer, perhaps even more happy. And formal evaluation of that programme confirmed this, saying that the participants both had an increase in self-esteem and an improvement overall in mood. These positive results motivated us to extend our offer, and we're now working with a whole range of community partners, including a community centre for the over 55s, a group of trauma survivors, the mental health charity Mind, an art therapy group for people who've got a personalised healthcare budget. And now I would say that our wellbeing offer has become a key part of what the museum does. All of our workshops offer the opportunity for participants to have some kind of cultural engagement with museum objects, whether that's viewing or handling, and then move on to some sort of creative or making experience. That in itself is not unusual, and indeed many museums in the UK have a similar wellbeing offer which involves object handling and creative practice. But what is unique, or at least highly unusual about Central St Martin's offer, is that all of the people delivering these workshops are qualified art and design teachers, all of whom have an active role within the art school. And because we're surrounded by students, there are also lots of opportunities to meet or even be taught by them. What I want to do now is give a brief outline of the activity under those 3 headings. So that's object handling or cultural engagement, creative or making, and then what art and design teaching practice can bring to the wellbeing agenda. Almost all of the Museum and Study Collection's wellbeing workshops begin with some kind of opportunity to engage with artefacts. That might be viewing a film, leafing through prints or watercolours, or even leafing through a rare book. Now, these object engagements are a really good opportunity to draw people out of themselves and get people talking. And they also give a chance for the people who are leading the workshops to assess participants and start to understand the group dynamics. There's considerable evidence to suggest that working with objects and artefacts in museum and gallery settings can have considerable healthcare benefits. That can be anything from reducing anxiety or giving an increased sense of meaning in people's lives to actually reducing the experience of physical pain. Professor Helen Chatterjee, who was one of the academic leads of the Museums on Prescription programme, has also done some really interesting research into the haptic properties of object handling. So that's about the importance of touch when handling museum objects, particularly in a wellbeing setting. So where possible, the people taking part in workshops should be encouraged to actually handle objects as well as just to view them. Whether handling museum objects or even just looking at them, the sense of excitement in our workshops is palpable when participants are entrusted with objects that are considered to be rare or ancient or have some kind of artistic value. One of our workshop participants got really excited when he was handling an original Edoardo Paolozzi print, and he was saying, I never thought I was going to get to handle an original. And it's these kind of really engaging and exciting, inspiring experiences which can start to move people on from the illness narrative and the negative stories that we often tell ourselves. Following on from the direct handling of objects, most of our workshops move on to some kind of creative or making experience. Generally, these are fairly low-key, using readily available materials, but in some instances we have been able to team up with other courses in Central St Martin's and provide access to really exciting equipment like a heat transfer process. We've also been able to capitalise on the presence of our student body, nearly all of whom have a creative practice, and many of whom are really interested in socially engaged practice. Creativity involves a number of attributes, including openness, tolerance of ambiguity, the ability to solve problems, and the ability to take managed risks, all of which can play a really serious part in improving mental resilience. It's creativity that allows us to move outwards from the present and to start conceptualising solutions to complex problems or life's big challenges. Creativity also gives us a safe space to explore things like positive and negative emotions. We learn things about ourselves from the things that we make, and it might be a chance to start resolving or working through conflict. Finally, it's even been argued that creative activities provide a space for creating hope. Many of those attending our workshops are keenly aware of the health benefits of making, whether that's preventing the onset of Alzheimer's or just providing a safe space to work through emotions. Indeed, one of our participants described the workshops at Central St Martin's in just those terms, a safe zone where he was away from what he described as the pain of reality. For him, the creative process wasn't just about healing, it was also about having a way to think through and express ideas. It's important to us that all of the people delivering our wellbeing sessions are qualified art and design teachers with an active role in the art school. Art and design pedagogy has developed over more than a century of student practice, and it's all about providing a framework that scaffolds a student-centred journey. Given that that's the case, there is much about art and design pedagogy that can also be mobilised in a wellbeing context. Teaching in the art and design environment is seen as a partnership or an exchange, a conversation between equals which allows the staff and the students to explore ambiguity together. That process might involve making space for some kind of emotional engagement or thinking about the extra-rational dimensions of learning. It may also be about providing safe space for self-reflection. Managing the emotions that result from our wellbeing workshops, whether that's from the object engagement or the creative activity, is a really key part of what we do. And that process of moving from the creative activity to the personal and back to the creative activity is something that we've developed through working with our students, many of whom find that their educational journey is a very emotional one. I'd like to spend a bit of time here talking about flow states. Again, that's all part of the pedagogic process. So for the artist or maker, the flow state is really the holy grail. Flow states were first described by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi as a way for the person to really lose themselves in an activity. So it's typified by complete engagement with the activity, where the participant loses all sense of time and self. Flow is important because it's rewarding and because it results in a positive state of mind. So given that that's the case, that it has the ability to distract people from the everyday and to create this complete absorption and a positive state of mind, it's obviously got implications for the wellbeing agenda. Creating the right properties for flow states in the classroom is something that art and design teaching staff are very experienced at doing. Now, one of the key things that's required for a flow state is having exactly the right level of challenge. Set a challenge that is too low and the result will be boredom and a lack of engagement. Set a challenge which is too hard and then the student is going to feel completely overwhelmed. Much care has been given in our wellbeing workshops to the kind of activity that we set up. So it depends on the kind of group that we're engaging with, and some of them are quite advanced in terms of their art and design practice, but we tend to shy away from activities like drawing or painting because people perceive that that requires some level of skill or aptitude. We prefer to focus on things like weaving or collage or printmaking because they're much more forgiving for people who don't have an existing art and design practice. It's important for staff during the wellbeing workshop to assess the level of individual participants and then to tweak the workshop accordingly as it progresses. This is where the student ambassadors come into their own. We often have 2 student ambassadors in a room with the workshop participants, and the students can walk the floor and give individualised feedback to participants as the workshop progresses. The ongoing provision of feedback is another requirement for flow states. Now, for many people, that feedback can come from the creative process itself, from seeing what you're making emerge. That's excitement enough. But in the art and design context, we also need feedback from external sources, and that most often comes from the crit or critique. Now, the crit or critique is not without its problems, and it can be particularly difficult in an educational setting because students feel that it's exposing and that they may potentially come under attack. So when we're offering up the crit in a wellbeing context, it has to be very carefully managed as a safe space for people to share those very personal stories. And while the feedback that comes from a crit should be honest, it also needs to be positively framed. We make sure in each of our wellbeing workshops that we create space to come together as a group and look at what's being produced with a critical eye. This can provide an ideal opportunity to draw people into the group and get a conversation growing. The ability of flow states to really block out the external environment and let people lose themselves in an activity has very obvious implications for the wellbeing agenda. If even for a short time we can switch off that negative narrative and block out the intrusive thoughts, then the positive impact on health and wellbeing can be significant and long-lasting. I should be honest about the fact that running this kind of wellbeing programme is resource intensive. It takes a lot of staff time to make contact with community partners and then to devise, set up and run the workshops. However, we continue to develop our wellbeing offer because we believe it's really important, not just for our participants, but for us as teaching staff and professional museum curators. In Central St Martin's, we have something we describe the research, practice and teaching triangle. So having developed a practical model of delivery, which I believe has real impact, I've been doing some research into the experience of our workshop participants through the conduction of semi-structured interviews. I've written a book chapter about that work, which will be coming out later in the year in a volume edited by Helen Chatterjee and Thomas Cador and entitled Objects for Learning and Wellbeing. That will be published by Routledge in late 2019. I've also used my experience to inform my teaching practice, and I've been developing a series of workshops for students looking either at emotional engagement with objects and emotional responses to objects, or about ways of turning your practice into a socially engaged practice. Now that's given me a whole new platform for working with our students, many of whom are very politically motivated and want their professional practice to have a really positive impact on the world around them. I've also been working with a fellow academic, Professor Joe Mora, to develop the Creative Practices Education and Wellbeing Research Network. This network has drawn together counsellors, creative practitioners, academics, teaching staff, students and recent graduates, all of whom have a professional practice that addresses the wellbeing agenda. More information about our work in this area and some film footage from our recent symposium on vulnerability are available on our website. Being part of that network has really helped me to situate the work that we do. So while what we do may have therapeutic value, I have to be really clear that we are not therapists and what we are offering is not therapy. Rather, we recognise the impact that loneliness, social isolation and a lack of meaning can have on people's lives. And what we are giving instead is an opportunity to connect, to be inspired, to work through negative emotions and to move on from those negative stories that we so often tell ourselves. Developing these wellbeing workshops with our community partners has been an exercise in hope. It's given a new lease of life to museum staff and to museum objects, as well as those who've been generous enough to give their time and come and learn with us.